So the Ukrainians will not accept any sort of peace deal unless it's forced upon them by the countries that are supplying them with weapons. Oh, and a quick word on that. There's a lot of shit going on out there about how we don't know what's happening with the Russian weapons, or I'm sorry, with the Western weapons that are going to Ukraine. Two things. Number one, we know exactly what's happening. Call your congressman, because we have full reports of every individual Javelin and Stinger. Video footage is required to give back as part of the accountability processes. So there's really nothing missing here. I mean, if you're going to rob Western assistance, you're going to go after the humanitarian aid. We haven't seen that happen at scale anywhere. So, don't say you're asking a question. Don't say we don't know. We do know. All the data is there, and every congressperson has access to the full information. Number two, with the exception of 2 Patriot batteries, every single piece of equipment that we have given the Ukrainians is stuff that was slated for dismantling anyway. It's technologies and weapon systems we haven't used since the 90s, and we were either going to destroy it or give it to an ally. Here we are. Okay, so that's that. Sorry, a little rant. People get me every once in a while. I hate it when people deliberately lie. What was the other half of the question? Data suggests we're going very firmly in the opposite direction, on both sides of the Atlantic. The Europeans have had it underlined very, very clearly to them what will happen if Ukraine falls. They know the next phase of the war, if Russia gets his way, comes for the European Union. And number two, on the United States side of the equation, a lot of the naysayers have been proven to be relatively foolish, and the removal of people like Tucker Carlson from being front and center of the American political conversation has really done wonders for people to look at this from a much more nuanced light and a much more honest light. So the more recent polls suggest that support in the United States for Ukraine has risen by about 1/3 over the last 4 months, which is one of the sharpest political shifts we've seen in any question for the American citizenry in a very, very long time. As for how long we can maintain this, remember that the United States, the largest expeditionary force in the world with a standing army of nearly 1 million men, has 30 years of back equipment that they can put into this before they start to affect the United States Army's regular military preparedness. The only weakness we have is with artillery shells, which we've used a standardized system for a while. And so we've tripled the output of our factories when it comes to building those munitions over the course of the year so far. We're going to need to triple that again. That is the soft spot in this. But when it comes to the rank and file equipment that you use for the war, Challenger tanks, anti-aircraft, bullets, all of that, we look pretty good on our side of the Atlantic. NATO, not so much. The Germans have already given pretty much everything that they can. And I know that people have given the Germans a lot of crap for not giving a lot, but they are the 3rd largest donator of equipment so far. The big sticking point between the United States and the Germans is that the United States has wanted to give more faster. And the Germans are like, wait a second. It's not enough to train the Ukrainians on how to use our gear. We also have to train them on how to maintain our gear. And if you think about in a war where things get broken all the time, that's a really good view when it comes to preserving war fighting over the long term. Because not one tank that goes there is not going to get shot at. And you have to make sure it can participate in more than one battle. Sure, let me bring up this bad boy map. Okay, the red zones are the territories the Russians occupied at the end of the last war. The pinks are what they roughly currently hold. In addition, territory that they've captured in this war and have held, and then the yellow is territory that they had but lost. Right now, the Ukrainians are doing 2 big pushes. The one going south from Zaporizhia, the goal is to get to the Sea of Azov so that they can then target the Kerch Strait Bridge directly. Now, if you guys remember last year, someone blew up part of the Kerch Bridge. It used to have 4 road lanes and 1 rail lane. 2 of the road lanes were destroyed, and the rail line was so damaged it can't take cargo any longer. So what the Ukrainians want to do is, if they can, that southern push, if they can get to the Sea of Azov, they achieve 2 things. Number one, that last road connection on the Kerch Bridge can be targeted directly, and that's the end of all supply there. And number 2, if they can reach Azov, then land supply north of the Sea of Azov stops, and the entire southwestern front of Ukraine and all of Crimea go from being a launching point to attack Ukraine to an area that has no troop support, no fuel, no food, no ammo, no nothing. And you trigger, hopefully, a collapse in the Russian political system, because it will become obvious to everyone that the Russians can't even support their own forces. And that is where the bulk of Russian forces are. They're having a hard time punching south. This is the area that the Russians have really concentrated their efforts when it comes to defensive emplacements. So you've got a line of mines, and then a line of things like Dragon Teeth that are anti-tank enforcements, and then a network of trenches. And so far, the Ukrainians have proven unable to get past the mines, much less getting through the real defenses. So I don't want to use the word stalled. There's too many pieces in motion, but it's not going great. The eastern punch into places like Bakhmut, that's actually going a lot better, because the Russians never bothered fortifying the territories that they've held since 2014. And so, especially when it comes to the more recent gains in this war, places like Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are actually having significant effects. Not enough to achieve the sort of breakthrough that is necessary to break the Russian front, but there is more promising activity there. But I've got to have a little bit of caution here. Any battle in which the Ukrainians kill 3 times as many Russians as they lose of their own troops is a battle that the Ukrainians have lost. They're outnumbered massively in this war and between the countries. And the only way that they can win it is by achieving breakthrough, winning a war of movement, and inflicting at least 8-to-1 casualty ratios on the Russians. And that's what we saw last year in places like Kherson and Kharkiv. We have not seen anything like that in the offensive to this point. It's not quite an attritional fight. They're still killing a lot more Russians than they're losing, but just not enough. And unless they can break through and force a rout, it's difficult to see the counteroffensive in its current form really changing the overall strategic picture unless something new comes into the equation. That might be things like longer range missiles, but from the point that the United States and NATO give those to the Ukrainians, it's a couple of months before they can actually impact the battlefield. So we're already talking best case scenario like September, and the end of fighting season is October, because that's when it starts to get muddy again. Doesn't mean things can't change. War is all about unpredictable outcomes, but at the moment, I don't see a lot of movement. The biggest hope the Ukrainians have right now is that the Wagner effect has removed the best troops the Russians have from the field and introduced a several-day interruption in equipment flows. And the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that on the Eastern Front. But if we were going to see a big breakthrough, I think if we don't see it in the next week, we're probably not going to. Obviously, that would not be great from a PR point of view, but it would demonstrate a couple of things. Number one, that the Ukrainians are perfectly capable and willing of carrying out extraterritorial attacks, and we've already seen that in several places in Ukraine of late. So from a military point of view, you got to give them some credit. From a diplomatic point of view, the idea that the Ukrainians would have removed from contention the single largest energy artery on the planet, and one that the Germans in particular depended upon. Something that we know is that the Swedes know who did this, but they have not said so out loud. Now, I've always thought, because it's the Swedes, that the reason they did this is because if you accuse the Russians publicly with proof of doing the attack, then everyone in Europe has to admit that the Russians have deliberately destroyed European energy infrastructure, and that means you have to cut off all ties overnight. And the Swedes want to make sure Europe has enough time to disengage itself from Russia so it doesn't cause a permanent depression.